The stage looks magical, bright lights, flawless performances, and the promise of escape. But behind the curtain, split-second mistakes can turn into an accident. In this video, we're uncovering 6 tragic on-stage deaths that prove entertainment often comes with a fatal cost. It was June 11th, 2016. In Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, the humid evening pressed against the crowded streets where music and laughter spilled from bars and clubs. Inside one of those dim venues, people packed shoulder to shoulder around a low stage, expecting nothing more than a night of jokes. Daniel Rogers, 44, balanced 2 lives. By day, he worked as a part-time office administrator, methodical and steady, ensuring payrolls were filed and schedules organized. By night, he reinvented himself as a comedian, leaning into physical humor and self-deprecating routines. Friends said his clumsiness on stage masked a careful, reserved man off it. He used comedy as release, often performing unpaid gigs just to hear laughter cut through the monotony of work. Risk for him was rarely in life, but always in performance. How far he could push a pratfall, how convincingly he could mimic a dangerous stumble. Small clubs like the one he favored had narrow stages with uneven lighting. Performers worked close to the edge, where only a few feet separated them from the audience. The floor was bare concrete, dotted with tables and chairs pushed tight together. Most comedians adjusted their routines to the space, keeping movements contained. Daniel, however, relied on exaggerated falls and sweeping gestures. He carried no props beyond a microphone and a beer, but his act demanded space the stage did not give. The environment added tension, a performance style built on imbalance in a room that gave no margin for error. That night, the show drew a full crowd. Daniel had already downed several beers before stepping up, trying to loosen nerves. Audience members later described his movements as bigger, more reckless than usual. The heat inside the room was stifling, sweat visible on his shirt as he threw himself into exaggerated stumbles. Several colleagues had quietly voiced concerns about his reliance on drinking before shows, but he brushed them aside. For him, the looseness fed his timing. The club offered no safety measures, no railing, no padding below the edge, just a small rectangle of wood elevated slightly above the tables. As the set built, Daniel leaned heavily into his physical routine. At one point, he pretended to lose balance, lurching backward in a long, comic stumble. Laughter filled the room, but the lighting hid the edge of the stage. He stepped too far. Witnesses recalled the sudden drop, his body vanishing from sight in an instant. The fall was abrupt and uncontrolled, cutting through the laughter with a sickening thud. Daniel struck the sharp corner of a table as he fell, the impact landing squarely against his head. The force spun him sideways before he hit the concrete floor. Several audience members later told inspectors that the sound of impact silenced the room. Blood quickly spread across the floor beneath him. Witnesses saw his body twitched once, then went still. At first, some thought it was a continuation of the act, but the severity became undeniable within seconds. Staff rushed forward, one employee kneeling to begin CPR as others cleared tables back. Panic rippled through the room, shouts for help piercing the air, urging for medical services. Despite efforts, Daniel showed no signs of consciousness. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but the trauma was catastrophic. He was declared dead at the scene, the injury too severe for intervention. City officials later investigated the venue. Inspectors noted the lack of stage barriers and inadequate lighting as contributing factors. Within weeks, Chicago mandated that small clubs install protective measures around specific elevated stages. Daniel's funeral in Chicago was modest but full. Co-workers, family, and fellow comedians filled the pews, many still shaken by the abruptness of his death. His children sat near the front, quiet in their grief. It was September 12, 2015, in London, England. The small theater's lights glowed against rows of expectant faces, families and friends waiting for a familiar Shakespeare production to begin. Behind the scenes, actors prepared with routine focus, but on stage, one set piece carried a flaw that would soon collapse under pressure. Alice Turner was 31, a stage actress who had spent years working in community and fringe productions. Theater had been her passion since adolescence, though it offered little financial stability. She worked part-time jobs between roles, sacrificing income for the possibility of bigger opportunities. When she finally landed a lead in a London Playhouse production, it marked the closest she had come to recognition. Known among peers for her discipline, she often pushed through long rehearsals with little complaint, trusting her body and voice to carry her through. Theater at this level operated under constant cost pressure. Props and sets were reused between productions, patched when necessary but rarely rebuilt. The wooden balcony used in the fight scene was central to Alice's role, providing dramatic staging during her monologue. It had been assembled years prior, reinforced with hinges and railings that had seen repeated strain. Crew had flagged the balcony's railing as weakened, one hinge loose at its base, but repairs were delayed to keep the schedule intact. Actors depended on such sets for safety, yet often lacked control over the equipment's condition. That evening, the audience filled nearly every seat. The show had received strong word of mouth, and Alice's performance was already drawing attention. Her part demanded both physical movement and emotional weight, requiring her to climb the balcony, lean forward, and project outward. The routine had gone smoothly in prior performances, but the hinges wear was increasing with each use. Crew members had considered bracing it with temporary supports, but time constraints and budget meant the piece remained unchanged. The risk, though noted, was set aside in favor of moving forward. The performance progressed steadily. The crowd engaged with the story. Alice delivered her lines with precision, her timing sharp, her presence commanding the stage. As she reached the pivotal fight scene, she ascended the balcony, gripping the wooden railing while reciting. Witnesses described her movements as confident, her voice carrying across the room. The other actors positioned themselves below, prepared to continue the sequence. Without warning, a sharp crack echoed through the theater. The railing gave way beneath Alice's weight, splintering at the loose hinge. Her body pitched forward abruptly, momentum carrying her head first toward the stage. The audience gasped, assuming for an instant that it was part of the act, until the impact silenced the room. She struck the stage floor with force, her head colliding against the wooden boards. Blood spread quickly from beneath her as her body twitched involuntarily. Actors froze in shock, breaking character, unable to process the sudden shift from performance to emergency. Ushers rushed toward the stage, calling for medical help while guiding families out of the theater. The set stood broken, the railing hanging loose. As staff gathered around her, she was lifted and rushed to the hospital by the staff, but the damage was severe. The head trauma sustained from the fall left no possibility of recovery. Alice Turner died later that night, her injuries overwhelming medical intervention. Her funeral in Surrey was modest, fellow actors gathering in silence, placing flowers on her coffin. In the weeks that followed, British safety inspectors conducted a full review. The theater was heavily fined for negligence, and reinforced staging standards were mandated across similar venues. The production closed permanently, remembered less for its performance than for the tragedy that ended it. It was July 21, 2018, in São Paulo, Brazil. The air was damp and heavy after a day of scattered rain, the pavement still slick from showers that refused to fully clear. Crowds gathered at a neighborhood square where a temporary stage had been erected. What was meant to be a celebratory evening carried a quiet risk no one expected would turn fatal. Marco Lima was 28, a mechanic who spent his evenings playing guitar with friends in small clubs. Known for his steady work ethic and unassuming manner, he often described music as the balance to his long hours at the garage. He had never played a stage as large as the community festival, and the invitation meant more than exposure. It was validation. Friends said he approached it with the same discipline he brought to fixing engines, focused, meticulous yet humble about his own talent. Outdoor stages for such events were assembled quickly, often with rental equipment and volunteers working under pressure. Power cables ran beneath tarps and scaffolds, connecting lights and amplifiers. When rain fell, the risk of exposed wiring increased sharply. Organizers relied on plastic sheets and hasty wiping to make the surfaces usable, but true insulation required time and inspection they did not have. Musicians trusted that the crew would contain the danger, but in reality the system remained vulnerable. By evening, the audience had grown, families clustering under umbrellas as music filled the square. Marco's band prepared backstage, tuning instruments while stagehands tried to push standing water off the plywood platform. Electrical cords ran near puddles, their insulation visibly damp. Some artists hesitated, pointing out the risk, but organizers dismissed their concerns, citing the tight schedule. The band stepped onto the stage to applause, Marco carrying his guitar across the slick boards. He adjusted the strap, tested a chord, and approached the microphone. Witnesses later described a faint hum through the speakers, a warning sign overlooked in the momentum of performance. As Marco leaned toward the microphone to sing, a sharp crack burst through the speakers. His body jerked violently, arms stiffening as electricity coursed through him. His guitar strings acted as a conductor, locking him to the current. The convulsions were immediate and visible. Bandmates rushed forward in panic, one attempting to grab him, only to be shocked himself and recoil in pain. The crowd shifted from cheers to screams, confusion turning to horror. Smoke began to rise from Marco's shirt near the strap buckle, the electricity burning through fabric. His body seized, then sagged, still tethered by the guitar cable. A staff member finally cut the main power, plunging the square into silence except for shouts of alarm. Marco collapsed onto the wet stage, motionless, his chest scorched where the current had exited. Medical staff on the scene pushed through, but the damage was irreparable. Efforts to revive him failed in full view of hundreds of onlookers. Marco Lima was pronounced dead shortly after being removed from the stage. His sudden death shocked both his co-workers from the garage and his small circle of fellow musicians. Authorities launched an immediate investigation into the festival's equipment. Inspectors concluded that faulty wiring and inadequate rain protection caused the electrocution. Regulations were tightened, mandating stricter electrical inspections and waterproofing measures for outdoor stages across the region. His funeral in São Paulo was crowded with family, friends, and bandmates. Many wept openly as guitars were placed beside his coffin. It was September 3rd, 2016 in Mumbai, India. The television studio floor buzzed with rehearsals, cameras being wheeled into place, and production assistants rushing to meet the day's schedule. A quiet fragility hung over the set, where faulty equipment older than the dancers was relied upon to hold firm. Neha Kapoor, 26, had made her career as a background dancer in variety shows and music specials. She was not a star, but her consistency made her one of the first names producers called. She accepted demanding hours, last-minute changes, and unsafe setups without protest, believing compliance would keep her employed in a competitive industry. Colleagues described her as diligent and steady, always arriving early and rarely missing rehearsals. For Kapoor, each routine was a paycheck and a step toward stability, not glamour. The studio system relied on efficiency above all else. Heavy lighting rigs, some weighing several hundred pounds, were suspended by clamps and chains above the stage. Proper procedure required regular inspections, but in practice checks were sporadic, often delayed by deadlines and budget pressures. Dancers moved below these lights, trusting that unseen equipment overhead would hold. For performers like Kapoor, the risk was accepted as part of the job, one they could not refuse without losing work. On that afternoon, the production was under pressure to finish a segment before prime-time deadlines. Choreographers pushed the troupe through repeated takes, while stagehands hurriedly adjusted lighting cues. Some dancers exchanged glances when they noticed a visible sway in one of the overhead fixtures. A warning could have delayed filming, but schedules were unforgiving. Kapoor, like the others, pressed forward, rehearsing a routine that required tight spacing beneath the hanging lights. The sequence demanded energetic spins and synchronized steps directly under the suspended rig. Kapoor concentrated on her timing, pivoting sharply as the director urged more intensity. Crew members at the edge of the set muttered about the heat and the vibration from the amplifiers rattling the scaffolds, but no one stopped the take. Midway through the routine, the warning became reality. A loud metallic snap echoed across the studio. Witnesses looked upward just as a spotlight, its clamp broken, detached from the rig. The light plummeted, striking directly onto Kapoor's back with a heavy thud. She collapsed beneath the weight. The impact forced her face to the floor, her body pinned and motionless as cables whipped across the stage. The music halted in chaos. Fellow dancers cried out, some rushing forward in shock, clawing at the metal casing in desperate attempts to lift it. The heat of the lamp burned their hands, and its weight was too great to move without equipment. Crew members scrambled for assistance as the director shouted for power to be cut. Medical staff from the set arrived quickly, but the damage was catastrophic. Kapoor showed no signs of movement, her chest crushed beneath the fallen rig. Emergency responders confirmed her death at the scene, her body shielded from cameras as production staff tried to clear the space. Her funeral in Thane was quiet, attended by family, close friends, and a handful of colleagues who placed flowers near her coffin. Authorities investigated the production company within days. The studio was fined heavily, and all filming was halted until every piece of equipment was replaced and recertified. It was December 17th, 2017, in Warsaw, Poland. The cathedral glowed with candles and garlands, the air filled with the murmur of parishioners waiting for the Christmas service to begin. Beneath the festive atmosphere, the wooden risers assembled for the choir carried their own strain, the weight of dozens of voices pressing onto structures not meant to bear it for long. Helena Zelinska, 63, had devoted her life to music within the parish. A retired schoolteacher, she found purpose in the choir, her alto voice steady and dependable. Known for mentoring younger singers, she attended every rehearsal and rarely missed services. For her, the choir was not only worship, but community, a place where discipline and faith intersected. The cathedral often relied on temporary staging to fit larger groups during major holidays. This time, carpenters had erected tiered wooden risers across the stone floor. They appeared stable, but some choristers heard faint creaks during warm-ups. Signs brushed aside in the rush to begin. With pews packed and clergy waiting, no one pressed the issue further. The choir, dressed in robes, climbed into formation as the organ swelled. The program was ambitious with layered harmonies requiring close spacing. Zelinska, standing near the back row, adjusted her posture carefully, balancing on the narrow plank beneath her feet. A few singers exchanged uneasy looks as the boards shifted slightly under the collective weight, but the conductor raised his baton, and the music began. As the performance progressed, the sound filled the vaulted ceiling, drawing smiles from the congregation. Yet tension rippled among those on the risers, the wood groaning louder with each movement. Zelinska gripped her hymnal tightly, steadying herself. A crack rang out, sharp and sudden, silencing voices mid-note. The structure beneath her gave way, the risers split in two, and the back rows pitched forward. Zelinska fell headfirst, striking the stone floor with a heavy impact. Witnesses gasped as robes and hymnals scattered, choristers tumbling over one another. Some scrambled to their feet in panic, calling her name, but she lay motionless amid the wreckage. Blood pooled beneath her head as the service dissolved into chaos. Paramedics rushed into the cathedral within minutes, but the injury was catastrophic. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Her fellow singers huddled in shock nearby. Parishioners wept openly, the sound of carols replaced by sirens outside. Her funeral was held days later in the same cathedral. The choir, diminished but resolute, sang hymns in mourning, their harmonies carrying through the space where she had last stood. Authorities launched an immediate investigation. They banned temporary wooden risers from large public services, mandating permanent platforms for choirs in major cathedrals. It was July 14th, 2017, in Manila, Philippines. Humidity hung inside the university auditorium as hundreds of students filled the seats for cultural night. The stage lights glowed against polished wood, hiding the unguarded drop into the orchestra pit just beyond their reach. Excitement and nerves filled the room, but beneath it all, the setup carried risks no one had fixed in time. Clarice Allaire was 19, a second-year dance student who rarely drew attention off stage. Reserved in class, she became animated during performances, admired for precision and intensity. Dance gave her identity and escape from the rigid expectations of her family. Professors praised her for discipline, saying she stayed late after practice to refine movements. She had no sponsors or professional affiliations yet, but classmates saw her as destined for auditions in commercial troupes. Unlike many who craved spotlight, Clarice pursued dance with quiet seriousness, trusting rehearsal and muscle memory over instinct. University performances often used the same auditorium, a space designed decades earlier. The wooden stage was elevated, ending in a sharp drop into the orchestra pit that extended several feet deep. At professional theaters, barriers or railings were standard, but here cost and tradition left the edge unguarded. Students had voiced concerns during rehearsals about dim lighting near the pit, where spotlights left the back corner dark. Organizers acknowledged the risk but pressed on, prioritizing schedule over safety. For Clarice and her troupe, the environment meant absolute focus was required. Missteps left no buffer. That evening, her group performed a fast-paced routine built on spins, synchronized leaps, and sweeping turns. The choreography demanded precision in tight formation, pushing them close to the stage's edge. Unlike smaller practice rooms, the auditorium introduced glare from lights and distractions from the crowd. A minor shift in spacing during rehearsal had already pushed them further back than planned. Some suggested adjusting choreography, but leaders insisted on maintaining the full routine. Clarice, though nervous, did not object. For her, staying sharp meant not questioning the flow. As the performance began, the dancers moved in rhythm, the audience clapping along. Clarice kept her eyes locked on her partners, her body sharp and exact. Witnesses later said she seemed fully immersed, her face set in concentration. The routine reached its midpoint, with spins executed in unison across the stage. Clarice's group fanned outward, their movements brushing the edge. The lighting in that section was uneven, and the wooden floor carried a faint slickness from prior acts. On the second spin, Clarice's foot slipped half an inch off her intended spot. She fought to correct her balance, but momentum carried her backward. Her heel caught nothing but air. Gasps filled the front rows as she dropped into the dark pit. The fall was violent, her back striking a steel scaffold bar with an audible crack before she crumpled onto the concrete floor below. The music continued for several seconds, dancers frozen mid-step, their faces pale. Audience laughter and applause turned into screams as organizers rushed to stop the track and cut lights. From above, witnesses could see her body twisted unnaturally in the pit, unmoving. Staff scrambled down ladders, paramedics summoned immediately. When rescuers reached her, she was still breathing faintly, but fractures and head trauma were evident. Students who looked on later described the image as unbearable, her body limp as she was lifted onto a stretcher. Despite rapid transport to a hospital, her injuries proved catastrophic. Clarice was declared dead that night, the impact too severe for intervention. Shock rippled through the university, with classmates struggling to reconcile the energy of her performance with the suddenness of her loss. Her funeral in Manila was crowded, classmates wearing matching uniforms in silent solidarity. Teachers and fellow dancers lined the aisles, many in tears, mourning both her talent and her youth. University officials issued a public apology days later. An internal report cited negligence in stage setup, noting the unguarded pit and inadequate lighting. However, no further improvements were documented after. Thanks for watching. If these performances that shifted from entertainment into nightmares piqued your interest, click here for more.